This is the weird sport that football comes from. And when I say football, I mean all the footballs. American football, rugby, and association football, which we in America call soccer. A word that we originally got from the British, they just decided to quit using it, whatever. I'm going to argue that the weird sport that modern football comes from is something called the Eton Field Game.
A unique type of football known as the field game.
But as you'll see, the lines are murky and you might disagree with me after watching this video. We're going to talk about the Eton Field Game in a second, but any history of football has to acknowledge that there is no geography that has a monopoly on kicking around or carrying an inflatable leather ball. In ancient China, Kuju was played by kicking a ball through a hoop that hung in the air. The sport was like soccer meets Quidditch. In 6th century Japan, Kamari was played by keeping a ball in the air with your foot. Native Americans had several ball sports. One literally translates from Algonquin to gathering to play ball with the foot. It was like modern day football with 100 people on one team. So the question is, from where or from what do rugby, American football, and soccer owe its origins? And for that we start in the European continent. Ancient Greece and Rome had their ball games that involved carrying, kicking, and advancing a ball. The Roman variant harpistum was a sort of progressive keep-away sport. In medieval Europe, a particularly violent form of mass football would crop up across the continent. Known as medieval mob or folk football, towns would have good old-fashioned games of get the ball to the other side of the town or the other side of an open square by any means necessary. An Italian sport in this category would take shape and is actually still played today. Known as Calcio Florentino or Florentine football, the sport looks a little bit like football, but it's just so much more violent. For example, instead of your teammates blocking the opponents from tackling you, they help you out by taking on the opponents in, I shit you not, hand-to-hand combat. Like Calcio Florentino, you can still see mob football today in the British Islands for Shrovetide festivals in Ashbourne and Kirkwell. They put one side of the town versus the other to get the ball to the opposing side of town. That messy, violent, and sprawling form of football started to get formalized and codified with rulebooks in British boarding schools. The Eton Field Game, that weird sport that I mentioned, came from Eton College in England. In the sport, there are only limited times that you can use your hand, like in soccer, and it also has rules around scrummage, which are important in rugby and American football. Soccer would build off the Eton Field Game and change the rules to permit less contact and more open field play. Throw in a relatively small goal-scoring area, and with those changes, you've got the sport that we know of today that favors speed, agility, and footwork.
It's one of the great goals from the magical, mercurial Lionel Messi.
At another boarding school, they were creating a different sort of game. As legend has it, a boy, William Webb Ellis, decided to carry the ball with his hands in a game of boarding school football, and the sport never looked back. Their game was originally played more like the Eton Field Game. They kept many of the scrummage rules, and adding in the ability to carry the ball, they created a sport named after their school, rugby. That sport would ultimately favor a balance of strength and athleticism and reward positional creativity and opportunism in a fluid but structured play. Because someone is carrying the ball instead of dribbling it, the game naturally makes tackling a feature in order to stop the player who's carrying the ball, and that makes it more injury-prone than soccer. Both rugby and soccer were exploding in the United Kingdom at about the same time that the British Empire was becoming the largest empire in the world. That's the reason that British forms of football would become dominant globally. British students exported rugby to American universities, and after more rule changes, we would get American football. In rugby, you can't play or participate unless you're on your team's side of the ball, which is creating an imaginary line across the field. In America, they got rid of this rule, allowing players to go ahead of the ball. That opened up opportunities for blocking that didn't exist in soccer and rugby. That plus tackling made the sport particularly brutal, even deadly, as players would create wedges that would just ram into each other over and over at high velocities over the course of a game. President Roosevelt actually stepped in and convened a safety committee because of how dangerous the sport had gotten. To prevent injury, American football introduced padding and also started making teams set up behind a line of scrimmage after the ball carrier was tackled to give the sport more structure. Those features, along with allowing the forward pass, made American football a sport with several very different roles and prioritized precision in carrying out complicated blocking and carrying schemes on a stop-and-go basis. I would argue that the Eton Field Game is the spiritual predecessor to rugby, soccer, and American football because it's an oddly preserved version of British boarding school football before carrying the ball and tackling were reintroduced with rugby football later on. I think there's a strong argument for mass football, which cropped up spontaneously around the world, but let me know what you think in the comments. And as always, like, subscribe, and follow to The Context.